Good morning and welcome. This morning's webinar is overview of the Musculoskeletal Injury Prevention or MSI Prevention Certification Training Standard. My name is Krista Collins, Certification Training Specialist with Workplace NL, and I will be your facilitator for the webinar this morning. Before we go any further, I want to mention that MSI is the abbreviation for musculoskeletal injury. Throughout the webinar, you will hear me use the terms musculoskeletal injury and MSI interchangeably. Before we begin, I'd like to review some housekeeping items. In the handout section, you'll find a PDF copy of the presentation and additional resources that you can download during the webinar. Asking questions is encouraged. If you'd like to ask a question, type into your chat window and I'll respond at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time, I'll answer your question in an email. I also encourage you to complete the evaluation that will be sent by email. Feedback helps us develop better and more meaningful workshops and webinars, and feel free to list any future topics of interest. We will take a micro break at the 30-minute mark. We'll stand up and stretch to change postures and get the blood moving throughout your body. In this morning's webinar, I will discuss musculoskeletal injuries and legislation, statistics, MSI Prevention Certification Training, including the standard. We'll talk a little bit about competent trainers, and then I'll do a quick review of the curriculum. So before we start, Tina is going to get a poll question set up. So you can select your answer on the screen and the results of the poll will not be shared. So the question would be, what is your current knowledge level on this topic? And you can select very good, good, average, poor, or no knowledge. All right. So before we get into too far into the webinar, I'm going to begin with a brief safety moment on sitting disease. So sitting for prolonged periods of time has been called the new smoking due to increased health risks. Medical experts have started referring to long periods of physical inactivity and its negative consequences as sitting disease. Studies have shown that sitting or lying down for too long increases your risk of chronic health problems such as heart disease, diabetes, and some cancers. Too much sitting can also be bad for your mental health. A 2015 Canadian study found that more than 1/2 of an average person's day is spent being sedentary, sitting, watching TV, or working at a computer. So in the chat window, I'd like you to type some things that you do throughout your day to get you sitting less and moving more, whether it's at work or at home. So I'll give you a couple minutes now to type in some things that you do. Okay, we got a couple coming in here. So I see from one person, they set their Fitbit every 30 minutes to make them move, which is great. Walking, cleaning, walking, and organizing areas of the house. Those are all great activities to get you moving more. Some other tips and tricks to get you sitting less and moving more, whether at home or in the office, would be to take a 1 to 3 minute break every half hour during the day to stand up and move around. Stand up during phone calls, which somebody else just mentioned in the chat window there. Walk over to your colleague's desk to talk versus emailing or instant messaging or calling them. Schedule a regular 10-minute physical activity break into your day. Drink more water, which in turn will, I guess you'd walk to the washroom more. Have standing meetings or periodically stand and stretch as a group during meetings. Somebody mentioned in the chat window about setting the Fitbit or your fitness tracker to track your steps and to give notifications for you to get up and move. You can also set a timer to remind you to get up and move around. There are several apps that are available for those types of reminders. Also participating in physical activities with your children. Get up and move during commercial breaks on TV. Park your car further from your destination so you're walking more. Use the stairs whenever possible. Walk down every aisle at the grocery store, whether you need to or not, is also another good tip. So musculoskeletal injuries are the most common work-related injury in the province, representing 69% of lost time injuries. So before we get too far into this webinar, let's discuss what exactly a musculoskeletal injury is. So musculoskeletal injury, or MSI for short, and soft tissue injuries are two terms used interchangeably. There's also some other common names used, including musculoskeletal disorder, or MSD, repetitive strain injury, overexertion injury, overuse injury, and cumulative trauma disorder. According to Section 50 of the Provincial Occupational Health and Safety Regulations, a musculoskeletal injury is defined as an injury or disorder of the muscles, tendons, ligaments, joints, nerves, blood vessels, or related soft tissue, including a sprain, strain, and inflammation that may be caused or aggravated by work. So musculoskeletal injury is an umbrella term that encompasses many injuries and disorders of the soft tissues. Some examples include carpal tunnel syndrome, spinal disc injuries, for example, a herniated disc and sciatica, a pinched nerve, muscle and tendon strains, ligament sprains, tendinitis, and epicondylitis, with more common names being tennis elbow and golfer's elbow, and many more. MSIs can occur anywhere in the body, but they often occur in the back, shoulders, neck, elbows, and wrists. They can result from a single traumatic event, such as lifting a load that is too heavy, or they can develop gradually over time as a result of cumulative damage to a body tissue, such as working for prolonged periods at a workstation that is too high, which can lead to chronic conditions. Many people believe that MSIs relate only to office environments. However, these injuries are very common in every industry and occupation. Some of the more common occupations where there's a high prevalence of MSIs include healthcare workers, such as personal care attendants, registered nurses, and licensed practical nurses, general office clerks, light-duty cleaners and janitors, construction trades, helpers and laborers, retail salespersons and clerks, materials handling personnel, food counter attendants, truck drivers, and carpenters. The signs and symptoms of MSI are not the same for every disorder or condition. There are many different signs and symptoms, and they can range from minor discomfort to severe pain. MSIs are costly, as evident by the statistics you'll see shortly, but most importantly, they can be very painful and sometimes debilitating. They can alter the quality of a person's life. Signs and symptoms may present immediately as a result of an acute injury, but more often they appear gradually over time and progressively worsen. We may not connect the dots between symptoms we may be experiencing and the work we're doing. So if you were one of the people working from home during the pandemic, you may have experienced some minor discomfort after a period of weeks or months, and it could progress even more as time goes on if left unaddressed, or if your setup or work patterns do not change. So some common signs and symptoms to look out for include pain, ache, tenderness, soreness, tightness, stiffness, numbness, redness and swelling, shooting or burning sensations, muscle weakness, decreased movement, and even loss of strength or function of a body part. It's important that workers are educated about the signs and symptoms so they can recognize early signs and symptoms of an MSI. It's not only important, but it's a legislative responsibility of employers to educate their workers. So during the next section of the webinar, we're going to review the legislative requirements for MSI prevention in Newfoundland and Labrador workplaces. So due to the prevalence of musculoskeletal injuries in Newfoundland and Labrador, there were 7 sections added to the Provincial Occupational Health and Safety Regulations in 2009 for employers to prevent MSIs. Sections 50 to 54 require employers to recognize factors in the workplace that may expose workers to a risk of MSI, evaluate this risk, and establish controls for workers to implement or follow. It also requires consultation with the Occupational Health and Safety Committees, worker health and safety representatives or designates, and workers who show signs or symptoms of MSIs when risk assessments are conducted by the employer. as well as to deliver education and training to workers in the MSI hazards in their work area and the controls they are required to use. There are also specific sections pertaining to seated and standing work and lifting and handling. In the next series of slides, each section of the MSI legislation will be reviewed in more detail. Sometimes the legislation may be difficult to understand or interpret, so Service NL has created an occupational health and safety explanation guide to make the legislation easier to understand. The link is written on the slide if you'd like to jot it down or take a screenshot or photo. Tina has also placed the document in the handout section of the webinar located on the right-hand side of your screen. So Section 50, subsection 1 of the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations includes the definition of an MSI that I just reviewed. Section 50, subsection 2 outlines the general responsibility of the employer for musculoskeletal injury prevention based on recognizing the risk factors that place workers at risk for MSIs and evaluating those risk factors. Risk factor recognition is the first step in a process involving recognition, evaluation, control, and monitoring. This is also known as hazard rec. Risk factor recognition and evaluation will be conducted by persons who are knowledgeable of work procedures. The Occupational Health and Safety Committee or designates should be consulted through the risk factor identification and evaluation process as well. Section 51, subsection 1, states the employer must eliminate or minimize the risks by creating control mechanisms for the risk factors found during the risk assessment. Where elimination is not practicable, the risk should be reduced to the lowest practical level. The factors with the highest level of risk should be controlled first. Care should be taken to ensure that reducing the risk of MSI from one factor does not increase the risk from another factor. For example, if sitting all day has been found to be a risk factor, the control cannot be to stand all day, as that introduces other risks into the work environment. Section 51, subsection 2 states personal protective equipment, or PPE, should not be used as a primary approach to control risk for MSI. It should only be used when engineering and administrative controls have been shown not to be practical. Some examples of PPE for MSI includes gloves, for example, vibration dampening gloves or friction gloves, as well as devices to protect against contact stress, so for example, knee pads. Section 51, subsection 3, requires the use of temporary controls if the introduction of permanent controls will be delayed. For example, the cost of or time required to develop permanent control measures may require that they be phased in over a period of time. This section does not authorize the employer to delay the introduction of practical control measures for other reasons. Section 52, subsection A, requires workers be educated on the applicable risk factors for any work they perform and the potential health impacts on the body. These risk factors should have been previously identified during the risk recognition process. Workers will also need to be trained on how to identify the signs and symptoms of MSIs. Because all work has a physical component to it, from lifting boxes to sitting behind a desk, risk factors will be identified in the majority of jobs. Therefore, most workers will need education under this section of legislation. Section 52, subsection B, requires workers to be trained so that they are able to effectively apply the control measures in their work. Workers should know the control measures available and how to use or implement them as needed. Workers should be able to demonstrate an understanding of the education and training. To check this, it may be useful to ask workers about the risk factors present in their job and if there are specific procedures or equipment they use to reduce risk. Section 53 of the regulations talks about consultation with workers. So consultation with workers, which took place in the risk recognition portion of the process, should be revisited when monitoring the effectiveness of controls. If monitoring shows there's been no reduction in the level of risk to workers or reports of discomfort have been made, the effectiveness of the measures taken will need to be considered. A decision should be made as to whether additional or different corrective actions should be taken. If the control introduces other or different injuries or signs or symptoms, or any new risk factors are recognized during a review, these need to be evaluated and appropriate risk control measures taken. Section 54 is titled MSI Consultation. So consultation includes seeking the participation of the affected parties and asking for their input on measures taken. So Section 54, subsection 1 states the employer is required to consult with the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, Worker Health and Safety Representative, or designate as applicable. Section 54, subsection 2 requires the employer to consult with the affected workers when a risk evaluation is being done regarding tasks or functions performed by those workers. The affected parties would be the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, representative, or designate, workers with signs or symptoms of MSIs, and a cross-section of workers performing the task. The cross-section of workers will take into account differences in age, shift schedule, gender, height, weight, and work location. Climatic conditions can vary considerably, and clothing or icy surfaces may result in different levels of risk for similar tasks. Section 55 talks about seating or standing work. Section 55, subsection 1 states, where a worker in the course of his or her work has a reasonable opportunity to sit without detriment to their work, an employer shall provide and maintain suitable seating for the worker's use to enable them to take advantage of that opportunity. Subsection 2 states, where a substantial proportion of work can be done while seated, an employer shall provide and maintain for a worker a seat suitably designed, constructed, dimensioned, and supported for the worker to do the work, including, where necessary, a footrest that can readily and comfortably support the feet. And subsection 3 says, where a worker is required to stand for long periods in the course of his or her work, the employer or contractor shall provide an anti-fatigue mat, footrest, or other suitable device to provide relief. Section 56 of the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations deals with lifting and handling. So lifting and handling of loads, usually called manual materials handling, is often physically demanding work. Manual materials handling includes lifting, pushing, pulling, carrying, handling, or transporting loads. The intent of this section is for employers to reduce the amount and type of manual handling that a worker must do. To accomplish this, the employer must provide, where reasonably practical, appropriate equipment that will help workers lift, lower, push, pull, carry, handle, or transport heavy or awkward loads. A heavy or awkward load includes equipment, goods, supplies, persons, and animals. As a result, this section applies not only to industrial settings where objects are handled, but also to workplaces such as hospitals, long-term care facilities, veterinary clinics, and pet stores where persons and animals are handled. As you can see in the images on the slide, there are various devices available that can assist workers when manually lifting and handling, including a hose to a container on a trolley that reduces lifting of a liquid-filled container, a rotating pallet holder, a spring-loaded hand truck platform that eliminates stooping and bending. For additional examples of devices available for lifting and handling, you can refer to the Service NL's Occupational Health Requirements Explanation Guide, which is located in the resources section of the webinar. So year after year, MSIs continue to be the leading type of lost time injury in Newfoundland and Labrador workplaces. This type of injury affects, on average, over 3,000 workers each year, to the extent that it impacts their ability to continue working and they lose time from work. They account for 69% of all claims involving lost time from work every year, 71% of all costs related to lost time claims, 75% of all lost time weeks from work, and $103 million in annual claims costs. So it's strongly believed the MSI Prevention Training Standard will help reduce these alarming statistics. So we will now look at some statistics from the top 5 injuries for MSIs. So the healthcare industry includes hospitals, nursing homes, social services, daycare services, physician offices, and health and community services. Musculoskeletal injuries to nurses, so that includes registered nurses, licensed practical nurses, and personal care assistants, make up almost 50% of all musculoskeletal injuries in the healthcare industry. Handling patients is the most high-risk activity in this sector. Paramedics are also at a high risk of MSIs. The service industry includes a range of sectors, including accommodation services, food and beverage services, amusement and recreational services, personal and household services, government services, and business services. In the service industry, public works and maintenance laborers are injured most often. They account for approximately 8% of all MSIs in the industry. Auto service technicians, food counter attendants, and material handlers are also on the top 10 list for high-risk occupations for MSIs in this sector. The wholesale and retail trade industry includes operations involved in the wholesale and retail of products and services such as food and beverages, apparel, household goods, motor vehicle parts and accessories, hardware, plumbing, heating, and building materials, machinery, equipment, and supplies. The most common occupation to get injured in the retail sector is the sales clerk. They account for approximately 21% of MSIs in the retail sector. Stock persons and materials handlers follow behind with approximately 12% and 10% respectively. Overall, these top 3 industries account for 75% of all MSIs in the province. So we're about 24 minutes in. We're now going to take a short micro break. So I'd like to invite you to stand if you are sitting to allow a change of posture. You can move your head from left to right, up and down. And I'd also like you to draw your focus away from your screen so you can look at, the ceiling, or if there's a poster in the distance, or focus on something that's a little bit further away than the screen you're looking at. So now we're going to provide more detail on the MSI Prevention Certification Training Standard. So why did Workplace NL create this MSI Prevention Training Program? As you can see from the statistics, the prevalence of these types of injuries in our workplaces is placing a burden on our workforce, and this has led to the development of the MSI Prevention Certification Training Standard. Workplace NL developed a training program that will provide workers with the education and training they need to not only fulfill their legislated responsibilities, but to inevitably reduce the risks of MSI by teaching workers the tools to recognize MSI hazards, eliminate MSI hazards, and minimize risk when elimination is not possible. Workplace NL has a legislated responsibility to develop training standards and programs for various topics outlined in the Newfoundland and Labrador Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations. We presently oversee 8 mandatory training standards and 2 voluntary training standards, including MSI prevention. During the development process, a cross-jurisdictional review was completed. This review verified that no Canadian jurisdiction was delivering a certification training standard for MSI prevention. So Newfoundland and Labrador set the benchmark. Today, I will cover the more important points from the standard, but the full standard itself, with full details, is available on our website and in the handout section of this webinar. So as I just mentioned, this training standard is Workplace NL's second voluntary training standard. So voluntary training standards are those that are not legislatively required to be completed, but that would assist workplace parties in meeting their legislative responsibilities and reducing workplace injuries. Therefore, it's highly recommended these standards be availed of by the applicable workplace parties. So as I just discussed during the review of the MSI legislation, although the standard is voluntary, there is a legislative requirement for employers to provide education and training to workers who are at risk of an MSI. OHS regulations do not currently require workers to complete a specific certification training program, but the reality is workers are often not provided sufficient training by their place of work and are hired not knowing about the MSI risks related to their work, or about the control measures that can eliminate or reduce exposure to those risks. The reasons for many ergonomics or MSI prevention control measures may not be obvious or clearly understood by workers and employers, and this often leads to controls not being implemented or complied with. For example, the reason for a guard on a saw are quite obvious. However, reasons for implementing regular micro breaks are not so clearly understood. Many employers and workers do not understand the stress that is placed on the body when we hold body positions for prolonged periods or use repetitive motion to perform work. Because all work has a physical component to it, from lifting a box to sitting behind a desk, risk factors are likely to be identified in the majority of jobs. Therefore, most workers need to be educated. To equip workers with the knowledge to prevent the most common type of workplace injury in our province and to assist workplace parties in fulfilling their legislative responsibilities, Workplace NL developed a voluntary certification training program. By developing a training standard and detailed curriculum, Workplace NL has set the benchmark for quality learning objectives and instruction for MSI prevention. A certification training program provides consistency in MSI prevention training. It ensures workers receive the education and training they need to be able to recognize risks of MSI in their work and make informed decisions about what actions to take to eliminate hazards or minimize risk. So who does the training standard apply to? The standard applies to an employer who employs a person who may be at risk of developing an MSI, a supervisor who advises workers of ergonomic-related hazards in the workplace and provides workers with written or oral instructions and precautions to take, workers who follow instructions and training for devices and equipment and safe work procedures, and a person who is delivering MSI prevention certification training program. So training providers and trainers must apply and be approved by Workplace NL to deliver the MSI Prevention Certification Training Standard. To be approved, trainers must meet the minimum criteria of education and experience, including relevant ergonomics, human factors, MSI prevention field experience, complete a course content review session as prescribed by Workplace NL. The course content review will provide trainers with an overview of how the curriculum is to be delivered, including how to deliver the practical activities, and pass a trainer assessment as prescribed by Workplace NL. Recertification for MSI prevention is required every 3 years from the date of last certification. Recertification will consist of refresher training as prescribed by Workplace NL. It's the responsibility of the certificate holder to register and participate in a recertification program. So it's not yet been decided what the classroom or what the recertification course will look like or how it will be administered. But chances are it will be in class and potentially an online option as well. So now I'm going to get into a review or an overview of the MSI Prevention Certification Training curriculum. And I'll just remind you, if you do have any questions, you can type them in the chat window, and I'll take some time at the end to answer them. So there are 6 modules within the MSI Prevention Certification Training program. All modules start with outline learning objectives, and material is presented for each module using the participant manual and activity workbook to fulfill the learning outcomes. Within each module, there may be discussions and practical activities. And at the end of each module, the key points for workers and employers to take back to their workplaces will be summarized. The overall objective of this training is to reduce workers' risk of MSIs by teaching participants tools to recognize MSI hazards, eliminate MSI hazards, and minimize the risk of MSI hazards through use of controls when elimination is not possible. The training includes 6 learning modules. The first module is Introduction to MSIs. The second module is Legislative Requirements. The third module is MSI Basics. The fourth module is MSI Risk Factors and Controls. The fifth module, Manual Materials Handling. And the final module is Computer Workstation Setup. So I'll now take a few minutes to review the learning objectives for each of these modules. So Module 1 is the Introduction to MSIs. So understand objectives and importance of MSI prevention training, which will enable employers, supervisors, and workers to take a proactive role in MSI prevention in their workplaces. There's also a section there which will describe the relationship between MSIs and ergonomics. So as I mentioned previously, an MSI is an injury or disorder of the muscles, tendons, ligaments, joints, nerves, blood vessels, or related soft tissue, including a sprain, strain, and inflammation that may be caused or aggravated by work. And ergonomics is the science of matching job demands to workers and products to end users. When the principles of ergonomics are implemented in the workplace, workers are healthier, safer, and more productive. And then the final piece of that module would be to understand the costs and consequences of MSIs. So investing in MSI prevention is a proactive step to avoid not only the financial cost, but also the emotional costs of injuries for employers, supervisors, workers, and their families. The second module talks about the legislative requirements. So we make reference to the occupational health and safety legislation related to MSI prevention. So sections 50 to 56, which we just went through in the webinar, for provincially regulated employers will be reviewed, as well as section 19 of the Canada Labour Code for any federally regulated workplaces. The importance of the internal responsibility system will be explained. So the internal responsibility system is based on the principle that everyone has a personal and shared responsibility to work together to prevent workplace injury and illness, including MSIs. The OHS legislation and the internal responsibility system also give workers, including managers and supervisors, 3 basic rights: the right to know, the right to refuse, and the right to participate. And then lastly, roles of workplace parties in MSI prevention will be discussed. So employers, supervisors, workers, OHS committees, and worker health and safety representatives and designates all have roles to prevent workplace injuries. The training will outline each of their roles in MSI prevention. Module 3 is MSI Basics. So this is where we get into understanding some basic anatomy and the types of soft tissues in the body, such as muscles, ligaments, intervertebral discs or spinal discs, and other connective tissues, and how they work together to help us move, and the limits that they have for how much they can be compressed, twisted, and pulled before they begin to break down. Damage to these and other tissues can occur suddenly, but often the damage progresses gradually over weeks, months, or years. We'll also describe the signs and symptoms of MSIs and understand the importance of early reporting. Workers need to be able to recognize the early signs and symptoms of MSIs because early recognition and reporting is the best way to prevent a full-blown MSI. Make sure to report early signs and symptoms to your supervisor, even if you are unsure of what is causing your symptoms. In the early stages, there are modifications that can be made to avoid the pain and cost of a full-blown MSI, and symptoms can still be reversed. We will also, in this module, review the various types of MSIs. So there are many types of MSIs, the most common being back injuries. These injuries and conditions can occur anywhere in the body, but often involve the back, shoulder, neck, wrist, hand, and elbow. And throughout this module, there are demonstrations of postures and body mechanics that aid in preventing MSIs. So body mechanics is the way your muscles and joints interact to produce movement. Proper body mechanics involves keeping your balance, keeping your elbows close to your body, using larger and stronger muscles to do the heaviest lifting, and maintaining a neutral spine. Damage to soft tissues can be prevented or minimized when your body is in a neutral posture. Your body prefers to be in neutral posture whenever possible. Combining neutral postures with proper body mechanics and healthy movement during daily activities will reduce your risk of MSIs. So this last learning objective is mainly delivered via practical hands-on activities. Module 4 is titled MSI Risk Factors and Controls. So this is where we get an understanding of the hazard recognition, evaluation, and control process. So the hazard recognition, evaluation, and control program at any workplace should include MSI risk factors when evaluating hazards. Oftentimes, many MSI risk factors are present at once, which increases the risk of injury. So it's important to be able to recognize MSI risk factors and learn to evaluate them. So in the curriculum, there are three types of MSI risk factors that we look at. The first type would be primary risk factors, which are those that increase the risk of MSIs based on how you do your work. So they include awkward postures, sustained postures, forceful exertions, and repetitive motions. These factors increase the physical demands placed on the body and have a direct effect on soft tissues. They're also the 4 risk factors which contribute to the majority of MSIs. We have secondary risk factors, which are generally present due to the environment that you work in. So they include vibration, local contact stress, improper lighting, and adverse temperatures. And the last type of risk factor is personal risk factors. And these are based on personal characteristics that you bring to the job and how they affect your work. So some personal risk factors cannot be changed. So for example, if you have an illness that produces physical limitations, and controls may need to be put in place for people with certain risk factors. All MSI risk factors must be evaluated to determine the amount of risk they pose to the worker. The factors with the highest amount of risk should be addressed first via one or more control measures. And then the last part of this section would be to implement controls to eliminate hazards or minimize risks of MSIs. So we would use the principles of good ergonomics, so fitting the job to the worker, to implement controls such as workstation design and setup, adjusting work schedules to avoid repetition in tasks, and wearing personal protective equipment to protect from contact stresses. So Module 5 is manual materials handling, and this module is largely practical hands-on activities. So it starts out with describing the steps of manual handling, including planning the task, which is essential to avoiding MSIs. It would then include demonstration of body mechanics principles. So workers need to be trained in the multiple principles of good body mechanics so they're able to select the safest lifting technique for a given task and to judge whether the task is safe to perform in the first place. The safest method is generally the one that gets you the closest to the load with the least amount of spine bending or twisting. And then we would demonstrate safe manual lifting and handling techniques. So the best control measure to prevent injury is to eliminate the need for workers to perform the manual handling tasks. But since this is not always possible, the safest lifting technique should be selected based on an assessment of the task, the location and characteristics of the load, and the physical capabilities of the worker. The final module of the training includes practical activities requiring a chair adjustment and proper computer workstation setup. So the first learning objective would be to understand how to adjust a chair. The evolution of technology has resulted in workers becoming more sedentary. Sitting for extended periods of time can lead to MSIs and other health concerns. The chair is the most important piece of equipment as it provides the main support for the body when seated. Once your chair is adjusted, introduce yourself to your workstation and make any required adjustments. And then the last learning objective would be to demonstrate design principles for computer workstation setup. So the way your computer's monitor, keyboard, mouse, and related equipment should all be positioned according to their frequency of use. When used properly, sit-stand workstations can also reduce the risk of MSIs from prolonged sitting, and this is discussed in this module as well. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. So in summary, today we have learned that MSI risk factors exist in every work environment, and MSIs are the leading type of lost time injury in Newfoundland and Labrador workplaces. Both employers and workers have responsibilities in preventing MSIs. To fulfill these responsibilities, workers need to be educated and trained to recognize MSI hazards and eliminate or minimize risk. This training program provides workers the tools to address MSI hazards in their own work in order to make their workplaces as well as their homes safer places to be. This validates the need for workplaces to participate in the MSI Prevention Certification Training program. Now is your opportunity to ask questions. Please type any questions into the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. And also, for those of you who may be interested in upcoming MSI prevention training dates, approved training providers and trainers can be found on the Certification Training Registry. So before we finish off today, Tina will now launch the final poll question. So I'll get you to please submit your answer on the screen. And again, the results will not be shared. All right, thank you for responding. So we do have a question. So the first question there, how can MSI be diagnosed correctly? My goodness, that's a tough one. They can be difficult to diagnose just because of the broad nature. We've reviewed the signs and symptoms of MSIs, and yeah, they can be difficult to diagnose. How they can be diagnosed correctly, I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question. But yeah, they can be difficult to diagnose for sure. Are there any other questions? All right, nothing else. Okay. So my contact info was put in the chat box. Tina put that in there. So if you do think of any questions, once we sign off of this webinar, you can certainly reach out to me, and I will be happy to answer your questions. There's also, before we end, I'd just like to mention that Workplace NL's podcast called The Signal is available. So workers have a right to a healthy and safe workplace. OHS practices and principles help protect workers from injuries and illnesses while working. So Workplace NL's health and safety podcast called The Signal explores current OHS topics that can improve the health and safety of workplaces. And there's a wide range of topics available that you can use for safety meetings or safety shares. They're really, really good information there. And then here's a list of some upcoming webinars for the next couple of weeks. So there's one next week. It's a pre-recorded webinar on workplace violence and harassment legislation overview. There's one on September 28th. Strategies for success in early and safe return to work. And on October 5th, there's a hearing conservation webinar. So for a complete listing of dates and locations, you can see the link there at the bottom of the screen. You can see what's upcoming and register. So I'd like to thank you all for attending this morning, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend. Thank you very much.